So I have a relationship now to the river, to the water, to the mountains here in a way that I could not have dreamed of before. And that feeling of connection, of belonging, it's a gift and it's a privilege. Hello and welcome back to Remember Why You're Here, a podcast for seekers and sensitives where you can relax, receive, reconnect to yourself, and remember the most important thing of all, why you're here. I'm Asia Suler, author, earth intuitive, and teacher. And in this episode today, I want to reflect on an event in my life and in my community that was instrumental in showing me and reminding me why I'm here. I want to talk about the lessons that I learned and the orientations, the perspectives that came through for me through living through a doorstep apocalypse. So we are just past the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Helene here in the mountains of Western North Carolina. A little over a year ago, the hurricane came through and massively changed our community, changed the mountains here, changed life as we knew it. The hurricane itself caused a 1,000-year catastrophic flood that destroyed many towns, including my town of Marshall, North Carolina, and my apothecary, which was housed in the old high school in a beautiful building in the middle of the river, on an island in the middle of the river. So if you're not familiar with Hurricane Helene or you haven't heard about this, this was a storm that came in from the Gulf Coast, traveled 400 miles inland to the mountains of Western North Carolina, and caused just really, in some ways, people would, during it, were talking about it as being biblical, like a biblical level of disaster here. We had over 1,000 landslides occur in the mountains here, tornadoes and windstorms that took down over 100,000 acres of trees. I have some friends whose, property land has like half the trees down, if not more, just thousands of trees falling in a matter of seconds. The neighboring county to us that houses Asheville, Buncombe County, lost over 17% of their trees in this event. There's over 73,000 homes that were flooded during this time, lives that were lost. And while there was these really specific catastrophic things happening over the course of the storm, what also happened was a huge time period afterwards in which we lost access to a lot of basic needs and cornerstones of living in the modern world. So Asheville itself, our closest city, was without power for weeks, was without drinkable water for over 50 days. A lot of people that I know were living without electricity, without water for upwards of a month or sometimes even longer. Many of us lost our access to the outside world, whether it was through the bridge going down that leads away from our house or one of our roads being covered in a landslide. 3 of the 4 major arteries, roads out of this area were destroyed or had to be fixed in order to be able to leave. So there was a period of time in which we couldn't even leave. The grocery stores were shut down. Cell service went down. So for days, we had no idea actually what was happening for our friends, what was happening in other parts of the mountains here. There was a whole package and series of things that went on that, then also put us into crisis mode for months afterwards. So it wasn't just the few days of the hurricane, it was months of recovering, getting electricity back, water back, communication back, rescue missions for folks who were further out, digging out our homes, our towns, restructuring our entire lives. And so while all of this was happening last year, pretty much everyone I know, myself included, was just in survival mode, basically, just trying to make sure that we could get through this, move through this, deal with the individual, personal, as well as collective losses that we were moving through. But, why I want to talk about it now is because so much richness and learning came out of this experience. And we are in the midst of this 1-year anniversary event, and anniversaries are deep. They're profound. Anytime there's an anniversary of something big in your life, whether it be beautiful or be hard, things come up for review, things come up to be understood and further integrated. And there was so much that I learned through this huge experience, this experience that was a very personal experience for me, but also a very collective experience where I live. It was an ecological experience as well as a geological experience. And I really wanted to share some of these learnings and lessons and insights because it's part of my integration process, but also because it feels like some of these learnings and gleanings are really pertinent to us as a collective right now, that this is not just a one-off experience here in these particular mountains, but that we are, as a collective, moving through really big times of transformation, upheaval, and change. And some of the learnings that came through this experience seem a bit like torchlights for me as we move into this time here on Earth and this era that we're currently inhabiting. So my love and the brilliant poet and thinker here in our community is Parsha, came up with this term, Doorstep Apocalypse. And I remember hearing this and just having it ring this absolute bell in me that what we went through here as a collective in the mountains of Western North Carolina, it was a small taste of what a collapse might look like, what an apocalypse could look like. It was like we had this window of time, days stretching into months, depending on where you were and what you were moving through, where we saw, what would happen if all the systems went down, if there were no grocery stores, if there was no gas, if there was, no way out, if there was no running water anymore, if there was no electricity, if what we had was to rely on one another and the land. And, this was just a small glimpse really in the scope of things. But I think about this etymology of the word apocalypse and how it in its original form means to uncover. And so there's a lot that we uncovered and saw during this time. So in this podcast today, I want to share some of what I learned through living through cataclysm in the hopes that some of the lessons that I gleaned, some of the perspectives that came through for me are helpful for you in the losses and the ruptures and the transformations that you are moving through in your personal life and that we are moving through as a collective. The first lesson that became very clear very quickly in this experience is that cataclysm reveals the core of the human heart. We have this story that in disaster, our true nature as humans will be revealed. And the fear is that that true nature is one of selfishness and violence and savagery. And I'm here to tell you that it's true that in disaster, our true nature is revealed. And what is revealed actually is that at our core, we are deeply altruistic beings, deeply compassionate and deeply caring. During the hurricane, and still to this day, but very obviously in the days and then weeks that followed this huge event, the outpouring of community care was so immense. I heard more than one person say, this has totally redeemed my faith in humanity. Within hours of the water receding, people were out rescuing people. People were setting up aid stations, medic tents, food distribution, getting supplies to folks. The grassroots organizing that happened here was truly amazing. And I think in some ways could be like a case study because it blew me away. And I think it blew a lot of people away who came in even from the outside to see what was happening. But at the heart of this, what really was revealed to me is like the core of our humanity, at the core of who we are as humans. We are deeply caring, deeply altruistic, and that hardship actually has the potential to reveal this to us. That when the going gets tough, our true nature shines through, and that true nature is one of generosity. In her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, Rebecca Solnit reflects on this. This was a book that a lot of people were reading after Hurricane Helene here in the mountains because it was so reflective of our experience and was giving us a lot of context for what it is that we're moving through. In her book, she looks at historical examples of disasters and how they reveal what people could be in everyday life, what communities could actually look like, how disasters uncover this for us, how apocalypses, these great uncoverings, show us actually what's possible, that we could be more connected to one another, more cooperative, more democratic, and more egalitarian. One of the things that happens in great community-wide disasters like this is that a lot of the social boundaries dissolve. So I know in our community that looked like folks who were, liberal back to the landers, working side by side, in community, in, these community hubs that were so essential to the folks here, side by side with folks who are more right-leaning, who, would be going to church on Sundays versus, whatever it is, the homesteaders who'd be staying at home and making altars underneath trees. And this dissolving of social boundaries had such a healing force to it, to have these like hierarchies and these boundaries come down to just be people helping people to live, to survive, to feel cared for. And that was like a really incredible aspect of this whole experience, that it wasn't just, like, let's make sure everyone is fed. It was, let's make sure everyone's cared for. There were free acupuncture clinics set up, people offering massages, Reiki. It was a true, deep, authentic care for other human beings. And there's a way in which moving through something like this can just really reveal to us actually what's possible in terms of how we can relate to one another, how we can be in community, and what the truth of the human heart is. And I think this is one of the fears that we have walking into this time of cataclysm in our world, great big change, is that this is just going to make humans more self-centered, less generous, more violent. But actually, there's a balancing effect that comes about when there is great loss in this way, where it actually instead brings to light our true nature, our nature as beings who are designed to be deeply altruistic and caring for one another. As I mentioned before, there were days where we had no cell service, and so nobody knew how their friends were, if their family was okay. Some of us, if we didn't have gas in our car, we couldn't get gas, we couldn't go anywhere, or the road or the way was blocked. But once cell service came back online, after, for some people it was a few days, for some people it was longer. But when that came back online, the flood of texts that we all received, they all started out the same way. It was, are you safe? Do you have food? Do you have water? And this was from people I was close to, but also just people in my community, anyone who had my number. We all just were reaching out to one another and making sure that we were cared for. There was this sense of this open-hearted caring, without condition, without hierarchy, just a deep caring for other human beings and for the world around us. It strips away all the things that prevented us from just being in that natural flow of care. It really was this experience of falling in love with people again, and it spread to the areas outside even these mountains. Like the influx of love and support and care that we received in the aftermath of this event, I literally witnessed it bring and stitch people's souls back together inside of their bodies here. I mean, it was a soul-wrenching time. And the kind of love and care and support, whether it was a love note or supplies or money that was sent in, donations, it changed everything for us. It reoriented us to this sense of this global community, or this community that spreads even wider than the hollers that we're within. And I hold on to this memory as such a talisman of what can be possible for us as, yes, we move into big times on this planet, that instead of it breaking us down, that it could actually build us up, build up our communities, build up this sense of collective love and care and agape. And that's the potential here. And Cataclysm has the ability to do that. I just want to say here personally that me and my business received over 800 donations during this time. And it is not hyperbole to say that was absolutely life-saving for me. It enabled me to devote myself to fundraising and helping to support mutual aid networks here on the ground for months. And so I just wanted to take that moment and say thank you. And I know I've said it before here, but it still astounds me. And as we're moving through this 1-year anniversary, it's just been coming up for me so much, just how profoundly soul saving that was and how much it meant to me. So if you need an example today of just miraculous care and the reality that we are a deeply caring species, then hopefully this will remind you. There was also this lesson that came through that was just, it's one of those things where we'd prefer to not have apocalypse be the thing that reminds us of this. But at the same time, I think this is an inbred part of the human experience, that crisis delivers us back into the expansiveness of the present moment. That crisis has this ability for us. There's this concept in anthropology that crisis, it deprives us of temporal agency, like our ability to structure, manage, and manipulate our experience of time. Like that gets taken away from us in crisis. And if you've ever experienced crisis in your life, whether it was acute or ongoing, you will know this feeling. It's like I've lost my ability to have agency over time. And this was like so obvious during this time of the hurricane in our recovery period. I mean, literally without electricity, without cell service, like we didn't know what time it was. The whole season of autumn was entirely different. I mean, the weather was different with all the trees down, the colors were different. It was like our day-to-day patterns were completely and utterly different. Cooking over fire with your neighbors for weeks on end because you don't have electricity. And so there's a breakdown in the normal routines that happens in crisis that brings us back into the present moment. It reminds me of the anthropologist Jane Goyer called this during the pandemic enforced presentism, like this sense of having to be, forced to be in the present moment. Like there's nowhere else you can be but in the present moment. And there's a function, I think, of crisis inside of our psyches and the human consciousness where it forces us to be present in the moment. It brings us into the present because we don't know and can't predict what's going to happen in the future. When your life gets turned upside down, you lose that ability to plan because your plans so far completely shifted. You can no longer like stick to this plan or this strategy moving ahead. And so, and often what was in the past, right, is not accessible in the same way. And so we're just in the present moment. We are here. And there's this weird thing that's happened with time in the year since the hurricane where it both feels like it's been 5 years and it feels like it's still happening. And it is still happening in a certain way because we are deep in recovery mode still. There are still places being cleaned out, stripped out, communities being rebuilt, bridges that still haven't been built. So we're still very much in the midst of recovery here. But it's powerful to embrace crisis as this force, sort of this consciousness and this entity that brings you into presence. Leaves you no other choice to bring you into presence. And what a potent experience to not just experience this personally, but collectively, within a collective. Within this entire region, this vast region that was affected by this huge event, all of us were completely in the present moment because there was nowhere else that we could be. And I think about this, as we move through real tangible change in our world, that there's this potential, right, for it to actually bring us into the present moment, this present moment where we have power, where we can create change. There's a reality that we forget all the time, right? That the present moment is actually all there is. Like, we can travel in our psyches to other places, but our body is only ever in the present moment. And so becoming present brings us back into our bodies, the seat of our power, the seat of our potential. And from there, we can find new ways of being. From there, we can co-create. We can literally, create a new future. And this was like so tangible in the aftermath of the hurricane, where there's all these choice points. Like, do we rebuild? For our town in particular, for Marshall, North Carolina, we've always known that we are in a high risk flood prone area. Do we rebuild? And then there were so many individual choices too, like, do I rebuild my house or do I move on? Do I go back to that job, even though now there's so much less job security within that field because it relied on tourism, and now there's so many less people coming here? All of these choice points. For me, a big one was, do I restart the apothecary? And I have a whole episode where I talk about my decision to let that go. But this was a moment of power, right? A moment of power to come into the present and be like, what do we want to create moving ahead? And as we experience more crises in our world, this becomes a potential to come more into the present moment, more into our bodies, and therefore more into our ability to co-create, to create our futures. So if you're moving through individual crisis at this time, like a personal crisis in your life, I want you to know that that's also on offer for you right now too. And it might not feel that way because you're in the midst of what feels like sort of this enforced presentism. But at the same time, there's also an opportunity here, and you are actively shaping your future in this moment simply through being present with what is. There's also this piece, and it was so glaringly obvious, but also so nuanced for us, that loss rewrites the larger map of the landscapes that we inhabit. So as I mentioned before, we didn't have access to information for days or sometimes weeks, depending on where you were living. And so we were piecing it together day by day. If you hiked out from where you were to get information, or if you had a radio, they started doing radio broadcasts. And so day by day, we start piecing this puzzle together of what had happened. And some of it was really shocking and confusing because we had major floods happen, for example, in areas where there was not major rainfall. And part of this process for all of us here was this like mapping of this larger landscape that we're a part of in this way that we had not mapped it before. So starting to understand what exactly happened, that this rain came and, hit the Blue Ridge Escarpment, and that it was this rain happening in a lot of ways higher up that came down the ridges in a very, particular way that it came down, causing landslides, feeding little creeks that fed bigger creeks, that fed rivers, that pushed massive amounts of water into places that frankly had pretty mild rainfall or weren't experiencing windstorms or tornadoes or some of these things. And so all of us were rewriting the whole map, understanding like from a bird's eye perspective, this place in which we live in a way that we like never did before. And at the same time, we were also rewriting the maps that we did know. So many places that I know and love and visited were just gone. They were washed away. They no longer existed anymore. There was a landslide. Access to them was completely blocked. I recently went on a hike to one of my favorite spots in the mountains, and it was like being in a completely new place, completely new. It went from being this beautiful creek with deep swimming holes and moss for miles and deep green to stripped bare rock. The river had completely changed shape and size, and landslides taking away whole sides of the mountains, trees piled up stories high inside the waterways and the river flows. And it was a really interesting thing to move through and to continue to move through, to have not only get this wider view of the landscape, piece together, weather patterns and ridge patterns and geology in a way we never had to before, but then also to rewrite the maps of the place in which we live. And at the same time, it really reminded me of this thing that I learned about grief once, where we know through a neuroscience perspective that our brain maps the world based on relationships. That is a huge part of how our human brain works. And so when we lose someone, part of why that grief and grieving is so disorienting and hard is because we have to rewrite the entire map of our existence, because that relationship no longer exists in the physical temporal map of our mind. This is why neuroscientist Mary Frances O'Connor talks about grieving as a kind of learning. Our brain is actively, intensely learning in the aftermath of loss because we're having to remap our entire existence. And so when we have any kind of loss, but when we have a kind of community-wide loss in this way, where we've lost community members, landmarks, places in which we literally mapped our existence, we have to rewrite and remap this entire landscape inside of our brain. And I think that there's this piece here where it's so similar to the grieving of a loved one, where through the intense pain and reorientation of this process, what we gain access to are new maps of meaning. We gain access to larger perspectives of ourself, our world, of what matters. And it's a hard-won meaning. To have that kind of meaning in your life, the kind of meaning that comes through grieving and having to rewrite the map of your existence, that is hard-won. And I think that this kind of learning is really at the bedrock of human wisdom. Our ability to find meaning and create landscapes of meaning in the aftermath of such loss. And I had this experience about a month after the hurricane. I guess it was about a month and a half, where I boarded an airplane and flew up north to my friend's baby shower. And it was such a surreal experience. I hadn't left at all the entire time of the hurricane and the recovery. And all of us were just in this intense place together, and leaving felt like literally going to an alien planet. I was like, where am I? What's happening here? Like there's no dust in the air. There's, there's no collective crisis. There's free flowing fresh water. But one of the things that happened was I got on the airplane, and I've flown out of Asheville Airport more times than I can count. I get on this airplane, and I've flown this specific route many times. And normally they fly up, they get altitude pretty quickly, you lose sight of the ground, you get a little bit of the mountains for a few minutes, then you're up and, you're sort of flying out. But what happened was we flew up, and the pilot took us over everything. Like we flew up and we flew right over Asheville. We flew over the hardest hit flood areas in Asheville. We flew east past Swannanoa. We flew over the reservoir that had been so damaged that it was unable to provide clean drinking water for people for upwards of 50 days. We flew over everything. It was unbelievable. And I'm looking around at everyone, and I'm like, are you all seeing this? Like, are you all seeing like what is happening right now? Like we are getting this literal bird's eye view. And it was just so monumental for me. I just had tears streaming down my face to have been on the ground and in it so intensely, like in a Tyvek suit up to my waist in muck in it. And then get this bird's eye view and see both at the same time, be able to see both the absolute catastrophe of what happened to so many of these communities, and to see that this was in a lot of ways like this ripple on the surface of the earth, like this small ripple in the vastness of the earth. And while this was a very physical experience for me, literally being up in an airplane and looking down at the ground, I think there's something about crisis that when we're willing to move through it, to be in it, to be in the present moment of that it ends up giving us this kind of perspective to actually see the crises in our life as this ripple in the wider field of the world and the wider face of the earth, and that doesn't diminish its importance or its bigness, but that we are also at the same time held by all that is not in crisis, all that is well, all that is growing, all that holds a meaning and a pattern and a perspective of possibility beyond what we might be able to access in that moment. But there's also this thing where disaster digs up what isn't working in our lives. So you've probably seen this in your own personal life and what you've moved through, that when the shiitake hits the fan, you're seeing very clearly what isn't working. So this was so unbearably obvious during the hurricane. This was a huge pain point for many of us here. The sheer amount of trash, the detritus of industrial society and capitalism literally washed up stories high on the banks of our rivers, mud, toxic mud, washing into our homes and down our streets. The ways in which many of these landslides happened because of, how we grade for houses, how we grade for roads. Things like this were literally uncovering, going back to that definition of apocalypse, uncovering like what is untenable, what doesn't work. We were confronted in this way that many of us in the privileged Western world don't have to confront. We were confronted with the sheer amount of trash and stuff that we produce as a culture. It's right there, right? It's right in our face. And I think that this is happening on a very physical level, but what I witnessed inside of my community is that this was also happening for people on a really personal level, really beginning to recognize, like, what is untenable in my life? Like, what can I no longer stand? What is toxic about the way in which, like, I've been living? Like, I refuse to go back to that. So many people made such big changes after the hurricane. And some of that was because we were forced to, because of something that we lost, or, something that changed irrevocably. But some of that was just because it brought us face to face, like, with the bareness of our soul and our desire in this life. And we realized, like, this isn't working. This is not how I want to live. This is not what I want to be adding to. And for me, a lot of what came up with this was patterns of overwork and overgiving, that I got sort of like a front row seat to a lot of my patterns of running myself into the ground in order to give. And it was a huge update and learning for me in a time of such profound need to really let go of that pattern and to put my oxygen mask on first, so that I could care for my family, that I could be there for my daughter, that I could still be involved in fundraising for my town without completely bottoming out. And I think that this happens for all of us in the midst of crisis in this way, that disaster digs up what is not working. And at the time, it can feel punitive. It can feel like we're just being confronted with this, like, nastiness of existence. But the reality is we are just uncovering what's always been there and no longer works. And when we can embrace that, we can make really powerful changes in our lives, changes that do truly transform the fabric of our existence. Disaster like this really rewrites for you what is important, what matters. And coming out of this experience, I really asked myself, what kind of life do I want to live? And what am I willing to risk to live it? And this is the exquisitely painful beauty that comes out of living through disaster in our lives, whether it's personally or collectively, is you arrive at the altar of this question. What do I want to live for? And what am I willing to risk in order to come alive? And I think if all of us asked ourselves that question and followed through, this world would be a completely different place. In the months after this event, I had so many people, anytime I ever said where I was from, like, give me this look, right? Of, like, just grieving and empathy and care. And it meant so much to me. And it often surprised them when I started talking about the event. And what I said was that there's a piece in which it was a great privilege. And specifically, it was the privilege of becoming a part of the story of this place. It was the privilege of becoming a part of the story of deep time. So we as humans are just kind of a flash in the pan so far on this planet. We have not been here very long at all. And we are living in landscapes that are millions of years old. And most of us don't get to see the kind of changes that happen to create the landscapes in which we live. We look around and we see the landscape as this sort of static entity. But when you move through something like this, the privilege is that you get to witness and be a part of the deep time story of that landscape. And it's terrible and beautiful all at once. So I got to witness, for example, the town where I live in Marshall. We are perched on this little bank next to the river with cliffs on either side of hard stone. And you look at the river valley and you look at the way it's shaped, and you realize after an event like this is why the valley is shaped this way, because this has happened many, many times over the course of the life of these mountains. Looking at someplace like the Swannanoa River Valley, which experienced horrific flooding, it's this wide valley. You almost wouldn't know it was a valley unless you zoomed out, because it's so wide. And yet we know that if this is a 1,000-year flood that we experienced, and these, this valley is 1,000,000 years old, then this has happened 1,000 times. And so there's this way in which we're literally like witnessing the creation of a landscape, the creation of this life story of this place. And that's a privilege. Like, what a privilege to be a part of this deep time story. And I see that in the world at large right now as well, that we're going through really big change on this planet. And it's a heartbreak, and it's also a privilege to live at this time, to be a part of this deeper, wider story that we are likely only going to be here for a small fraction, not just in our individual lives, but as a species. And we are a part of that story. We're witnessing that story. We are co-creating that story. And there's something that happens in your psyche when you can rework your perspective of it, to see it as a privilege, to experience that. Like, there are stones that have been unearthed by this hurricane that have never seen the light of day. Millions and millions of them, stones that have never touched a human hand. The ways in which the landscape here has been scarred is very much like the scarring that might come through childbirth. It's like, this is now a part of the story of this place, the body of this place. And like, just what a privilege to be here, to witness that, to move through that, to be with the earth in that way. And this was a commonality among many of the people that I talked to in my community here in this event, that there was no animosity towards the river. There was no animosity towards the mountains. There was only deep feeling. There was only grief. And there was only connection. The connection, actually, that we felt and feel now to this place in the aftermath is immense, deeper than it could have been before. I remember specifically kicking the door down to my apothecary when there's, a foot of mud left behind by 9 feet of floodwaters, and walking in and seeing that 9-foot flood line and everything that had been in there picked up, swirled around in some sort of slow moving eddy in the deep body of this river, and then gently deposited back down. I could see the etchings of the water as it went down over, hours and hours and hours. And I could feel, standing in that room, I could feel the body of the river having been in that room, the body of the river having inhabited the entirety of this valley. And to come into presence with an element like that, to come into presence with a force of nature, a being of nature in that way, is powerful and life-changing. And I think that this is really a part of our human experience, the deep human experience, the experience of our deep ancestors, that we moved through big cataclysm like this, where we were brought into contact with the bodies of this world in a way that widens our perspective, that forces us to our knees in awe, in reverence, in gratitude, in respect. So I have a relationship now to the river, to the water, to the mountains here in a way that I could not have dreamed of before. It's relationship building to move through something like this together. And And when I say together, I don't mean together as a human community. I mean together as a human and more than human community, together as an ecology. You feel deeply the ways in which you are part of that ecology. You are inseparable. And that feeling of connection, of belonging, of the rawness and intensity of being a body within bodies in relationship to the body of the land it's a gift and it's a privilege. There's a primacy now, a directness in the way in which I could communicate with this place in the aftermath of this experience. As being someone who's already very deeply connected to these mountains, having moved through this, it's the same as having moved through a major rupture with a human that you love. You probably have people in your life who you've moved through really hard things with, and on the other side, there's a closeness and an intimacy that wouldn't have been possible without having moved through that kind of rupture. And that's how I feel about these mountains now. And I think it's how we are all going to feel the more we move through big times here on this planet. That some of these cataclysms and disasters, that the touching of an apocalypse, a great uncovering, it actually then gives us the ability to create deeper intimacy and connection with this planet, deeper relationship, to really perceive the preciousness of this place that we're within, to uncover our connection to her, our connection to this planet, our connection to the landscapes we live within, our connection to our own deepest selves and what truly matters. So I hope that this podcast episode, while it was very personal for me and a tender project that I wanted to make sure I put out into the world, I hope that it also is giving you some perspective and support for helping you rewrite cataclysm in your own life. So may the disasters and the ruptures in your own life help you realize the true nature of your heart. May they bring you into the present moment in a way that expands your reality. May they help you rewrite the map of meaning in your life, help you release and see what's not working, and really start to see yourself as someone who is here to be in relationship with the deep magic of this planet, to be in relationship with this time of great change, that you have a role here to play, and that the individual disasters that we experience in our life help us connect to that, help us become the kind of people who can walk through the bigger story happening here on this planet. The word cataclysm comes from the Greek cataclysm, which is down, washing down. And I think that there's this level in talking about cataclysm where it's like we can really clear away, wash away the things that prevent us from living how we're meant to live, from living from our heart, from living from what matters, for seeing the unbelievable privilege that is living on this planet, that everything that has happened to us and that is happening to us currently and that will happen to us in the future is all a part of us moving into deeper connection, moving into deeper into our soul's path and into the great privilege of being a part of the story of this planet, the privilege that we all came here to be a part of. Surviving and making meaning out of your own losses and disasters, it feeds the greater whole. I think that this is, at the bedrock of human culture, is our ability to do this as a species. This is a huge feature of humankind. And, that when we move through these not only personal but huge society-wide soul-forging times, we come out better. We come out more aligned with our true nature and more aligned with the living world around us. And I think there's this level in which this is what true disaster prep is. Disaster preparation is not about hoarding resources, but is about being willing to walk through these arcs in our own life, to walk through these times where everything falls apart in our own life, and to learn how to show up with clarity and heart in moments of breakage. And as we walk through that, we learn how to become these people who can show up for this big change here on this planet. We can start to see that collapse is a coming together, that breakdown is a breakthrough, and that disaster opens your heart to be moved. It's moving. It's very moving to live through an experience like this. And when our heart is moved, we can move collectively into a new era. So thank you so much for listening to this episode for today, for being a part of the wider arc of this experience for me. This podcast came directly out of Hurricane Helene. The inception of this podcast, the name of this podcast, the support that I received during that time enabled me to start creating this podcast once we were out of crisis mode and I could start to resource on the other side. And so just by listening to this, you are a huge part of the arc of this experience. And with this open heart today, I just want to thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for all the ways in which you have so bravely walked through the cataclysms in your own life, for all the learnings, the hard-earned learnings that you have gleaned from that and that you are now bringing to the world. You become an even greater force of healing through walking through the natural disasters in your own life. And I want to honor you today for that. So if you are feeling moved to donate towards the continual recovery here, I'm going to put some links here in the show notes, specifically highlighting the beautiful building that house my apothecary that I have now been a large part of helping to rescue. I'm currently on the board of this building called Marshall High Studios, and we recently got nonprofit status. So I'm very excited about that. I will put that link there. If you are feeling moved, then there are some resources there. But truly, I just want to say that if we are in the midst of a doorstep apocalypse as a world, I am just so delighted that I can be standing here with you. I think there's this way in which we are on the threshold of a great uncovering, and I wouldn't want to be here with anybody else. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for everything that you've walked through in your own life. It has brought so much meaning to the whole. And may whatever greets you in the rest of your day, as you move through the meaning making in your own life, may it help you remember that thing that is really the most helpful and important thing of all. Remembering why you're here.